This presentation that I'm going to present today has developed as part of my current research, which tries to establish the practical aspect of the problem of evil. Previously, I wrote a book called A Muslim Response to Evil, Sayyid Nursi on the Theodicy, which concentrated mainly on theological responses given to the question of why a compassionate, all-wise, just God would allow evil to exist and happen in this world. Responses given by scholars such as Ash'ari, Maturidi, Mu'tazila, Jabriya, Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and Bediüzzaman Sayyid Nursi. As a follow-up to this research, a practical response in form of pastoral theology was necessary in my mind. What is pastoral theology? Pastoral theology is the branch of practical theology concerned with the application of the study of religion in the context of regular ministry. It is supposed to be more pragmatic than speculative and can maybe best described as the care of the soul. Pastoral theology is a recognized theological discipline within the Christian tradition, but it is not a discipline on its own right within Muslim theology. This, however, does not mean that it is completely non-existent within Muslim tradition. On the contrary, it has a very long history among Muslim thinkers and writers, especially among Sufis and mystics who wrote extensively on the soul, but it went by another name, Hikma, wisdom. So this is how I shall structure my presentation today. First, I will try to understand with you the Quranic concept of the definition of evil, shar, mainly asking the question, is our understanding of shar the same as that of the Quran? Secondly, I will examine Imam Maturidi's concept of the relation between khair, shar, and hikmah, wisdom. And thirdly, I'll try to locate aspects of pastoral care in Imam Maturidi's works. And I'll suggest to do this within the framework of what Irvin Yalom, professor of psychiatry, describes as the four ultimate concerns in psychotherapy. One, death. The second, freedom. The third, existential isolation. And the fourth, meaninglessness. Please note, however, that I consider this paper to be a draft, which is just a small portion of a much broader research, inshallah. And I'm a lay person, so positive critique on how I could successfully further this study is highly welcome. Now I'll start with evil versus shar. In the Quran, the term shar is usually translated into English as evil. However, there is a difference between the definition of shar in the Quran and evil as it is understood by many. While in Western thought, evil is mainly interpreted as moral evil, evils committed by human beings, and natural evil, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., the Quranic view of shar is different. Shar, according to the Quran, is the loss of God's grace, loss of guidance, loss of God's resignation, loss of understanding, loss of faith, loss of patience, and loss of hope. In other words, the Quran defines shar to be certain attributes, such as parsimony, going astray, rejecting or being ungrateful to God, adultery, violating a covenant or treaty, turning away from God, slander, and transgression. Shar, like khair, does not make a statement about wrong or right, but rather about the benefit or loss that an action or a situation brings. In the case of shar, the addressee in all circumstances is that person who chooses to be foolish, arrogant, stubborn, ignorant, impatient, and unwise. What is described as shar is the loss that is behind such behavior. Contrary to the term natural evil, there is no such thing as natural shar in the Quran. Shar is rather a relative term that can change according to a single individual. A loss that someone suffers, and which that person considers as being evil for him, can be a benefit and hence something good for someone else. Or a negative situation now that a person thinks is evil can turn out for him to be something good in the long run. Death, which has been considered by scholars such as Thomas Hobbes as the worst of evils, can be seen as necessary and good. In the light of all the above, it becomes clear that the Quranic definition of shar is different from the common understanding of evil. That is to say, the Quran's definition of shar corresponds to the so-called moral evil, described by Ninian Smart as human wickedness, and which is, according to Plantinga, the result of human choice or volition. Imam Maturidi's understanding of shar is in line with the Quranic definition thereof. When it comes to inflicts and calamities, however, unlike other scholars, Imam Maturidi explains those with wisdom, hikmah, rather than divine justice. He attempts to cultivate hikmah, wisdom, by enabling the afflicted to see God behind every event, thereby encouraging them to see their problems, trials, and tribulations as coming from the divine will. According to Maturidi, whatever there is accords with wisdom and is not without purpose. The whole universe is governed by God with wisdom. Wisdom meaning knowledgeable, purposeful competency. Maturidi contrasts wisdom with folly, safah, stupidity, the result of ignorance, jahl, which flavors one's actions with incompetency, meaning that the act described as stupid either works not at all or works wrongly. The next point emphasized by al-Maturidi is self-sufficiency of God that he relates with his wisdom. The relation between the two are that God, being self-sufficient, is not in need of anything, is in possession of everything, is therefore in control of everything, and can act in total wisdom. For only an imperfect action indicates the lack of wisdom, and an action is imperfect if the owner of that action must need at some point. Al-Maturidi seems to use different names of God for his self-sufficiency at different places in his Kitab al-Tawhid. At one point he uses Ghani, whereas at another point he prefers Rububiyyah. At a last step to finalize his framework, Al-Maturidi equates wisdom, hikmah, with justice, adl. Wisdom, he states, is the attainment of putting each thing in its proper place. Justice has the same ability to establish a balance in a cosmological sense, not to be understood merely as a structural, but also as a moral designation. Having said that, Al-Maturidi now equates the two terms, which opens the gates to examine evil in the context of wisdom instead of justice. In Topololu's first chapter of the Kitab al-Tawhid translation, entitled by him, Evidence that the Cosmos has one who gave it existence, Maturidi offers numerous proofs that the cosmos, being temporal, is not the adequate explanation of its own being. And in the second proof, Maturidi offers a quite interesting and unique approach explaining the existence of natural and moral evil. Here he states that would the world exist by its own essence, its state would not be the most appropriate of all conditions, and its attribution would not be the most appropriate of any other capacity. The fact that creation is mukhtalifun, different and varying, shows that its being is not self-existent. Would the world exist by itself, it would have to create the best of all states and the most appropriate of all attributes for itself, which would mean the legitimacy of the cosmos to be creative in all respects. Then, along with the cosmos itself, all evil and unpleasant, al-shurur wal-qaba'ih, would cease to exist. All this shows that creation came about by something other than itself, بغيره, and that other is God. Here, Al-Maturidi makes use of the existence of evil to prove the imperfection in creation, and hence that the universe is not self-existent. In other words, eternal, that it is eternal, but that rather it exists temporally, and that there is a God, and that He is the creator. How does all the above need to be understood on a practical level? What good does all this knowledge serve me as an individual being confronted with the reality of death, having concerns about carrying the burden of life on my weak shoulders, feeling lonely and forgotten in this seemingly meaningless world? At this point, pastoral care comes into play. Pastoral care should go, in my opinion, hand in hand with psychological therapy. Hence, what I suggest in this paper is to enlist Irvin Yalom's assistance. As a professor of psychiatry, Yalom located 4 ultimate concerns in psychotherapy. These are death, freedom, existential isolation, and meaninglessness, as mentioned before. We will look briefly into each one of these and seek for answers in Imam Maturidi. The first one is death. So Yalom states that the first very obvious, ultimate concern of mankind is death. We do exist now, but one day we will cease to exist. Death is an inevitable reality. There is no escape from it. By many, it is a terrible truth, and people respond to it with mortal terror. In fact, some philosophers, as I mentioned before, Thomas Hobbes, considered death to be the worst of evils. But not so Imam Maturidi. According to him, the reality of death also is part of God's divine wisdom, and as such is in accord with putting everything in its right order and place. Maturidi states that fear of death is for those who wish to live a long life. According to him, man fears death because he thinks of it to be painful and a definite end. But the longing for an everlasting life is a very strong feeling in every human being's nature. Hence, according to Maturidi, the only way to overcome this fear of non-existence through death is to have certain faith in that man will have an everlasting life in the hereafter, and that death is not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. Therefore, according to Imam Maturidi, the only way to cure oneself from this mortal terror is to know oneself, to know the Creator, and thus to change one's whole attitude towards life itself. Death becomes negative if man thinks of it as the end of all the success gained in life, for if life all of a sudden becomes meaningless for someone because of the existence of death. Maturidi, on the other hand, asserts that for someone who strives to know his Creator, life can only be meaningful with the existence of death. Death itself is not a punishment of some sort, and life after death is neither dark nor an abyss. It is a place where everyone will be treated with fairness, and a place where no one takes the burden of another. The person who knows his Creator will see death as a reunion with his true owner. Imam Maturidi further states that there is a wisdom in the act of death. Firstly, the fact that death exists is a means to discipline human beings. The world would have become a much uglier place to live in if there would have been no death and no life after death, for people would have considered all there is to be merely this life, with all its limitations, struggles, and endless needs. Secondly, the existence of death raises the awareness of responsibility in human beings. For God does not punish human beings right away for their shortcomings and bad behavior, but postpones it. Thus, the understanding that everyone will be held accountable for their actions in a life to come makes them become responsible human beings. The third wisdom behind the existence of death, according to Maturidi, is related to those who have been subject to injustice in this life. For if there is no death and no life after death, then there is also no place of compensation for those who have suffered hardship under the hands of tyrants and wrongdoers. For clearly no one is able to receive true justice in this life. The second ultimate concern, according to Yalom, though one might not think of it as such, is freedom. We consider freedom to be something positive. For years in history, mankind has striven for freedom and still continues to do so. However, if one thinks of freedom in terms of the absence of external structure, it becomes a dread. Imagine that man does not enter a well-structured universe that has an inherent design. He does not believe that he is responsible for his own world, life design, choices, and actions. Freedom all of a sudden becomes terrifying. It means that there is no ground beneath us, a void, an abyss. This viewpoint clashes with our yearning for ground and structure. Thus, Yalom states that to be aware of responsibility is to be aware of creating one's own self, destiny, life predicaments, feelings, and, if such be the case, one's own suffering. For the patient who will not accept such responsibility, who persists in blaming others for his dysphoria, there is no therapy possible. And then Irvin Yalom continues to state that in the deepest level, responsibility accounts for existence. And he gives a very vivid example. He states the following, and I'm quoting, "I was snorkeling alone in the warm, sunny, clear waters of a tropical lagoon and experienced a deep sense of pleasure and coziness. The warmth of the water, the beauty of the coral bottom, the sparkling silver minnows, the neon bright coral fish, all in concert created an underwater Elysium. And then I had a sudden radical shift in perspective. I suddenly realized that none of my watery companions shared my cozy experience. The regal angelfish did not know that it was beautiful. The minnows, that they were sparkling. The coral fish, that they were brilliant. The at-homeness, the coziness, the smiling hour, the beauty, the entire experience. I could, by the same token, glide through oil-slicked, watery, bubbling, with empty plastic Clorox containers and choose to consider it either beautiful or disgusting. At the deepest level, the choice and creation were mine." Here it is, man's responsibility for the nature of reality, a problem that Eastern and Western philosophers pondered upon. The way we see reality and the way we give meaning to it is our responsibility as conscious human beings. Man will either look at all contingent beings as beautifully designed art, each and every one of them pointing to their creator. This will make man feel cozy and at home in this vast universe. Or man will choose to change perspective and cut off the bond of each being with its creator. In this case, everything will all of a sudden become foreign, meaningless, and even disgusting. Imam Maturidi talks about the wisdom behind the creation of the universe. He states that everything in the universe has been created with divine wisdom and has a purpose. And man has been placed into this meaningful and well-structured universe with divine wisdom, and he has a purpose in life, and as a conscious human being, he reflects God's wisdom. As such, it is man's responsibility to question and ponder upon the wisdom behind every event in the universe, which will lead to self-knowledge and ultimately to ma'rifatullah, knowledge of God. Maturidi elaborates on this by stating that every creation in the universe is related to another one, either by being its purpose or by being its means. This shows that the universe is not based on quarrel, but rather on equilibrium, cooperation, unity, and wisdom. There is absolutely nothing in the universe that is purposeless, void, or useless, or coincidental. On the contrary, God created everything as an indication for his oneness and wisdom. Taking responsibility is also closely related to divine determining and free will. According to Maturidi, divine determining and free will have the duty to prevent man from irresponsibility and haughtiness. The moment man becomes too predeterministic in his thoughts and actions, attributing everything he does to God, the power of choice confronts him and reminds him of his responsibility and obligation. On the other hand, the moment he starts attributing all his good deeds and achievements to himself, divine determining confronts him again, showing him his limits and reminding him that without God's grace and help, he would not be able to achieve them. The right understanding of divine determining is thus very important, for it prevents human beings, on the one side, from feeling crushed under the burden of endless needs and desires, and on the other side, it prevents human beings from arrogance and pride and the thought that he is the sole author of his life, his destiny, and his feelings. The third ultimate concern of psychotherapy, according to Yalom, is isolation. Here we do not talk about isolation from other fellow human beings. We can be totally sociable and connected with others and yet feel utterly isolated. This is a fundamental isolation both from creatures and the world. It is the feeling of being ultimately alone in an indifferent universe. This is like an unbridgeable gap, the thought that we entered existence alone and that we must part from it alone. There is thus a tension here, Yalom states, between our awareness of our absolute isolation and our wish for contact, for protection, our wish to be part of a larger whole. Now let's make an excursion and try to establish that contact, feel protected and try to be part of a larger whole. Just imagine that I have an apple in my hand and I bite into the apple and I start eating it. The moment I've started eating the apple, I can now trace the apple back, basically, and then find my creator. So how do I do that? Imagine that the apple came from Germany, from some field. It's grown on a tree, on an apple tree, and then it's been collected by farmers. And it stayed in a sack for a few days until it's been transported all the way to here, to Amman. And then it stayed here in the kitchen for another few days before it's been served on the dinner table. Now, up until that moment, and throughout the journey of the apple, nobody has touched the apple. Nobody has eaten the apple, and that apple has been preserved until it arrived at that dinner table. Even at that dinner table, nobody else picked that apple until I did. And it has been, again, preserved as an whole apple until I did bite it and I ate it. So what does this show me? This shows me that there is a creator who knows me and who knows that I love apples and who has created one apple in Germany on an apple field, on one tree, and that apple has been especially created for me. And God made sure that nobody else touches that apple until it reaches me. Now this, if I think about when I bite the apple and I eat it, if I think about this apple this way, what do I gain from this? It shows me the name of Rahim, right? So what kind of feelings do I have when I think this way? First of all, I feel protected, and I feel connected, and I feel special, and I feel valued, and I know that there is a creator out there, and that I'm not alone, and that there is a creator who knows me, and who creates things especially for me, and he makes sure that nobody else gets to touch it until it reaches me. Now, according to Imam Maturidi, the only way to overcome this kind of isolation is a genuine belief and trust in a creator. He underlines his assertion with the following verse of the Quran from Surah Al-Ra'd. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَتَطْمَئِنُّ قُلُوبُهُم بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي إِلَى بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. Those who believe and whose hearts find satisfaction in the remembrance of Allah. For without doubt, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find satisfaction. Now, going back to the example that I just gave, this is what this establishes. When I think about that apple that I eat in this way, it immediately makes me connect with my Creator, and I have that kind of satisfaction in my heart. Imam Maturidi does allegedly not talk a lot in his works about the situation of a believer in this world. I might be wrong here. He rather prefers to approach the issue from the point of view of a covenant promise. He points out that life in this world will be difficult and distressful, but the result of being patient and having faith will bear wonderful fruits in the life to come. He stresses the fact that not only goodness, but also calamities and inflicts point to their Creator and serve as indicators. They will become means to a search for a perfect, impeccable Creator. And man will first come to know his own limits and faults, and ultimately find tranquility and satisfaction through letting God enter his heart. Thus, Imam Maturidi states that this world is like a bridge that will lead human beings to the afterlife. Compared to the afterlife, the time man spends in this world is very, very short. Nevertheless, the only way man can save himself from existential isolation through a strong bond with the Creator. Considering again all the aforementioned concerns, namely, if we must die, if we constitute our own world, if each one of us is ultimately alone in this indifferent universe, then what meaning does life have? Now we are at the point of meaninglessness. Why do we live? How are we supposed to live? If we have to construct our own meanings in life, can our own construction bear all the burdens that we are confronted with? Thus, the dilemma here is of us being meaning-seeking human beings who have been thrown into a universe that has no meaning. Now, here is another quote. Imagine a happy group of morons who are engaged in work. They are carrying bricks in an open field. As soon as they have stacked all the bricks at one end of the field, they proceed to transport them to the other side of the field. This constitutes, without stop, and every day of every year, they are busy doing the same thing. One day, one of the morons stops long enough to ask himself what he's doing. He wonders what purpose there is in carrying the bricks. And from that instant on, he is not quite as content with his occupation as he has been before. I am the moron who wonders why he is carrying the bricks. Quotation end. Yalom states that this is a suicide note of a despairing man who killed himself because he saw no meaning in life. Imam Maturidi would agree that everything we see in this world can be compared to data input. Our intellect is comparable to a computer. All the data we see around us is raw data that needs to be processed and analyzed by our intellect. This raw data will either be given meaning without knowledge, or it will be left meaningless, will be given meaning with knowledge, or it will be left meaningless through ignorance. For this is what Imam Maturidi arguably tries to explain in his writings when he talks about wisdom. He states that a wise person is the one who has knowledge. Not any kind of useless knowledge, though. Knowledge, ma'rifah, that will ultimately lead him to his Creator. Knowledge that will change him for the better and raise his rank. Hence, knowledge that will help him, through the grace of God, to see the wisdom behind things and events. Maturidi further states that ignorance is the opposite of wisdom, because it is the opposite of knowledge. It is to choose to stay foolish. And this definition has been made also when I was talking about the definition of shar according to the Quran. To go back to the suicide letter mentioned before, this person stopped long enough to think about what he was doing and the meaning thereof, to realize that as a human being with intellect and all the faculties he has, merely carrying bricks cannot be the purpose of his creation. Surely there must be another reason why he has been created. And this would have led him to a journey of seeking, or in fact maybe not really seeking God, because he is with us all the time. Maybe a journey of getting to know his creator, and through that knowledge getting to love him, which will lead to our heart satisfaction and our souls tranquil. Thank you very much for your time.